My coworker's sexual harassment complaint was fake, but HR believed her, so I'm destroying her career with the evidence I collected. The HR termination letter arrived via email at 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Subject line, immediate termination, policy violation. I was sitting in my cubicle at Meridian Financial Services reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed with the notification. The email from Janet Kowalski, Director of Human Resources, informed me that my employment was terminated effective immediately due to credible allegations of sexual harassment filed by Vanessa Sterling, a junior analyst in my department. I was instructed to gather my personal belongings under security escort and surrender my building access card and company laptop within the hour. No hearing, no investigation, no opportunity to defend myself. Just immediate termination based on accusations I knew were completely fabricated because I had never touched Vanessa, never made inappropriate comments, and had barely interacted with her beyond standard work communications. My hands were shaking as I read the email a second time, trying to process that my career of 8 years at Meridian was ending because someone had decided to destroy me with lies. Security arrived within 15 minutes. 2 guards I'd seen countless times in the lobby but never spoken to stood beside my desk while I packed my few personal items into a cardboard box. My colleagues watched from their cubicles, some with sympathy, most with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to be associated with an accused harasser. David Nguyen, who I'd mentored for 3 years, looked away when I made eye contact. Alicia Foster, who'd worked on my team since I was promoted to senior analyst, pretended to be absorbed in her computer screen. The walk to the elevator was the longest of my life, carrying my box past silent co-workers who'd attended my wedding 2 years ago, who'd congratulated me when my wife Laura and I bought our first house, who'd seemed to respect me right up until the moment someone accused me of being a predator. The security guards escorted me through the lobby where the receptionist who'd greeted me every morning for 8 years wouldn't meet my eyes. They stood beside me on the sidewalk until I put the box in my car and drove away from a career I'd built through 70-hour weeks and sacrificed weekends. I called Laura from the parking lot of a grocery store 3 blocks from the office because I couldn't drive home yet, couldn't face walking into our house as an unemployed man accused of sexual harassment. She answered on the second ring, immediately sensing something was wrong from my voice. "They fired me," I said, and the words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. "Vanessa Sterling filed a sexual harassment complaint. HR didn't even interview me, didn't ask for my side. They just believed her and terminated me." Laura was silent for several seconds, and I could hear her breathing change, could imagine her face going pale in her own office at the architecture firm where she worked. "That's insane," she said finally. "You barely know her. You've never mentioned her except to say she's new to the department. What is she claiming you did?" I explained that the termination letter hadn't included specific allegations, just referenced credible evidence of inappropriate conduct and unwanted advances. Laura's voice went hard in the way it did when she was truly angry. "We're getting a lawyer. Today. This is defamation at minimum. Wrongful termination, probably. You don't just let this happen." I drove home and spent the next 3 hours researching employment attorneys while Laura made calls from her office. She found a lawyer named Kenneth Bryce, who specialized in wrongful termination and defamation cases. His initial consultation fee was $500, which we could barely afford now that I'd lost my income. But Laura insisted we couldn't wait. Bryce's office was in a downtown high-rise, all glass and steel and intimidating corporate polish. He was in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that telegraphed success. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and delivered an assessment that made my stomach sink. "Here's the reality, Mr. Granger. Employment in this state is at will, which means Meridian can terminate you for almost any reason or no reason at all. If they claim they had a good faith belief that harassment occurred based on a complaint, that's generally sufficient legal justification. To win a wrongful termination case, you'd need to prove they knew the allegations were false and fired you anyway, which is extremely difficult." He paused. "Defamation is a separate issue. If Ms. Sterling made false statements that damaged your reputation, you could potentially sue her personally. But you'd need to prove the statements were false, that she knew they were false, and that she made them with malicious intent. That requires evidence." I explained that I had no evidence because nothing had happened. There were no inappropriate interactions to document or defend against because I'd never harassed Vanessa Sterling in any way. Bryce nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he'd heard this before. "The problem is that sexual harassment cases often come down to credibility assessments. If she claims you made comments or advances in private settings where there were no witnesses, it becomes her word against yours. HR typically sides with the accuser to minimize liability exposure. Even if you're completely innocent, the company's incentive is to remove the accused party, rather than risk a hostile work environment lawsuit from the complainant." He tapped his pen against his notepad. "I can send a demand letter to Meridian requesting the specific allegations and any evidence they relied on. We can threaten litigation and see if they'll settle to avoid court costs. But I need to be honest with you about the odds here. These cases are expensive, emotionally draining, and difficult to win. You're looking at probably $50,000 minimum in legal fees if this goes to trial, and even if you win, you're still unemployed and marked as someone who was accused of harassment. Future employers will find this in background checks. Laura and I left Bryce's office in stunned silence. We sat in the car in the parking garage and looked at each other, the reality of our situation settling over us. I'd been the primary earner. My salary at Meridian had been $95,000 annually, while Laura made $62,000. We had a mortgage, car payments, student loans, and we'd been trying to save for starting a family. Losing my income was catastrophic enough, but the sexual harassment accusation made me virtually unemployed and unemployable in the financial services industry. Any background check would reveal the termination reason, and no company would risk hiring someone with that history. I don't understand why she'd do this, Laura said quietly. You said you barely knew her. Had you ever had conflicts with her? Any reason she'd want you fired? I searched my memory for anything that could explain Vanessa's actions. She'd joined Meridian 6 months ago as a junior analyst assigned to our department. She was 26, fresh from business school, ambitious and confident in the way new graduates often were. I'd worked with her on maybe 3 projects, always in group settings, always professional. I'd never been alone with her, never had private conversations beyond basic work instructions. There had been no conflicts, no criticism of her work, nothing that could have triggered vindictive behavior. Then I remembered something that made my blood go cold. 3 weeks ago, our department director Harold Simmons had announced budget cuts that would eliminate 1 senior analyst position. The decision would be based on performance metrics and would be finalized within 2 months. I'd been competing for resources and recognition with Thomas Qley, another senior analyst who joined Meridian around the same time I had. We'd maintained a professional but competitive relationship, both angling for the same promotions and high-profile projects. If I was eliminated through termination, that removed competition for the remaining senior analyst role. I mentioned this to Laura, who immediately understood the implication. You think she filed a false complaint to help someone else? Who would she be helping? I thought about office dynamics, who Vanessa interacted with regularly. Thomas had taken her to lunch twice that I knew of, claiming he was mentoring her. He'd also recommended her for a high-visibility project last month, overriding my suggestion for someone with more experience. Thomas Qley, I said. He's been unusually friendly with her. I thought he was just being welcoming to a new employee, but what if there's more to it? I spent the weekend reviewing every interaction I'd had with Vanessa, writing down dates, times, and witnesses present. I pulled up old emails to document our work communication. Everything was strictly professional. Most emails were group threads, copying multiple people. The few direct emails I'd sent were basic instructions or project updates, nothing that could remotely be construed as inappropriate. I had 0 private messages with her on the company's internal chat system. Our phone records showed no calls between us outside of conference calls with multiple participants. The evidence was overwhelming that we'd had minimal personal interaction, which should have made her allegations easy to disprove. But Bryce was right. If she claimed harassment happened in private moments with no witnesses, my lack of inappropriate communication only proved I'd been careful, not innocent. The legal system and corporate HR departments were designed to believe accusers, which meant I was guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence was nearly impossible. Monday morning, I called Meridian's HR department and requested a meeting to discuss the allegations. Janet Kowalski's assistant said Ms. Kowalski was unavailable, but would respond to written inquiries. I sent a formal email requesting the specific allegations against me, the evidence HR had reviewed, and the names of anyone interviewed during their investigation. The response came 3 hours later. A form letter stating that personnel matters were confidential, that Meridian had conducted a thorough investigation, and that their decision was final. They would not be providing details about the allegations or evidence. The dismissiveness was enraging. They'd destroyed my career based on accusations they wouldn't even share with me, denying any opportunity to defend myself. Kenneth Bryce sent his own demand letter threatening litigation if Meridian didn't provide the complaint details and reconsider the termination. Their response came from their legal department, a letter stating they were under no obligation to provide employment records to former employees beyond confirming dates of employment, and that they stood by their termination decision based on credible evidence of policy violations. I started applying for jobs in my field, carefully crafting my resume to show I'd left Meridian voluntarily to pursue new opportunities. The first 3 companies I applied to requested references. When I provided names of colleagues at Meridian, 2 of them never responded to the reference requests. The third, my former supervisor, Gerald Whitmore, apparently told one company that I'd left under difficult circumstances, because I received a rejection email within hours of them contacting him. The 4th company did a background check that apparently included calling Meridian's HR department. I received a terse email stating they were no longer considering my application due to information discovered during verification. My career was effectively over. The accusation alone was enough to make me radioactive to potential employers, regardless of guilt or innocence. I'd spent 8 years building expertise and reputation in financial analysis, and Vanessa Sterling had destroyed it all with lies that I couldn't challenge or disprove. Laura started picking up extra freelance projects to supplement her income, while I collected unemployment benefits that covered maybe 1/3 of what I'd been earning. We cut every expense possible, canceled subscriptions, stopped eating out, postponed plans to renovate our bathroom. The financial stress was crushing, but worse was the emotional toll. I felt powerless and violated. victimized by false accusations while the system protected my accuser and refused to examine the truth. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, spent hours obsessing over why Vanessa had targeted me and how I could possibly prove my innocence when the burden of proof was impossible to meet. Laura suggested therapy, and I went to 3 sessions with a counselor who specialized in workplace trauma. He was sympathetic, but offered no solutions, just coping strategies for dealing with injustice I couldn't correct. I stopped going because paying someone to tell me my feelings were valid didn't change the fact that I'd been destroyed by lies. Then I thought about the security camera. Meridian's office had cameras throughout the building for security purposes. Every hallway, elevator, parking garage, and common area was monitored. If Vanessa had claimed harassment occurred at the office, there would be video evidence showing our interactions. I called Kenneth Bryce and explained this, suggesting we subpoena the security footage. He said that would require filing a lawsuit first, which would cost tens of thousands of dollars we didn't have, and even then, companies often claimed security footage was automatically deleted after 30 days. If Vanessa had filed her complaint strategically after enough time passed, the evidence might already be gone. But the conversation gave me an idea. What if I could access information about what Vanessa had actually claimed? HR had refused to share the complaint details, but there had to be documentation somewhere. Complaint forms, investigation notes, witness statements. If I could see what specific allegations she'd made, I might be able to identify inconsistencies or impossibilities that would prove she was lying. I reached out to Derek Cho, an IT administrator at Meridian, who I'd helped with a personal financial planning issue 2 years ago. We'd gotten drinks occasionally after work, and he'd always seemed grateful for the advice I'd given him about retirement accounts. I called him on his cell phone and asked if we could meet for coffee. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, and said he'd heard what happened and didn't think it was appropriate to be seen with me. His rejection stung, but I pressed harder. Derek, I'm innocent. The complaint is false. I need your help to prove it. There was a long silence. Then he agreed to meet me at a coffee shop far from the office. When we met the next day, Derek looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. I could lose my job for even talking to you, he said. HR sent a company-wide email saying anyone who had contact with you should report it. They're treating you as a security threat. I explained that I just needed to understand what Vanessa had claimed so I could defend myself, and that Meridian was refusing to provide any information. Derek shook his head. I can't help you access personnel files. That's immediate termination and probably criminal charges for unauthorized access to confidential records. But Derek mentioned something interesting. You know, Meridian archives all company emails on a server for 7 years for compliance purposes, right? Including deleted emails. IT can search those archives when there's a legal or HR investigation. I hadn't known that. So if Vanessa sent emails to anyone about me before filing her complaint, those emails would still exist even if she deleted them? Derek nodded carefully. Theoretically, yes, but I can't access them for you. That would be a massive violation. I understood, but the information was valuable. If Vanessa had discussed her plans with anyone via company email, or if she'd communicated with Thomas Kingsley about filing a false complaint, those emails would be archived. I needed to find a way to get them without implicating Derek or anyone else. Kenneth Bryce could subpoena email records if we filed a lawsuit, but that came back to the same problem. We couldn't afford the legal fees for litigation that might take years and had uncertain odds of success. I started investigating Vanessa Sterling herself, searching for anything that might reveal her motives or character. Social media was limited. She had a LinkedIn profile showing her education and work history, but no Facebook or Instagram accounts I could find. Her LinkedIn showed she'd graduated from Northwestern with an MBA in finance, had done an internship at Goldman Sachs, and had worked briefly at a boutique consulting firm before joining Meridian. She had 73 connections, including Thomas Kingsley, Harold Simmons, and several other Meridian employees. Her profile described her as passionate about financial analysis and women in business leadership. There was nothing suggesting dishonesty or vindictiveness, but there wouldn't be. People didn't advertise their willingness to destroy others with false accusations. I expanded my search, looking for any public records or news mentions of her name. Nothing significant came up except a mention in a Northwestern Business School newsletter about her graduating with honors. Then I found something unexpected. Vanessa had written a blog post on Medium 2 years ago, before joining Meridian, titled, Navigating Workplace Politics as a Woman in Finance. The post discussed her experiences at her previous jobs and her observations about gender dynamics in male-dominated industries. Most of it was unremarkable, standard commentary about challenges women faced with credibility and advancement. But one paragraph caught my attention. She wrote, Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't direct competition, but strategic positioning. If you can't win a fight on merit alone, change the battlefield. Create situations where your competitors disqualify themselves while you remain the obvious choice. The language was carefully vague, but the implication was clear. She'd essentially outlined a philosophy of winning through manipulation rather than direct competition. I screenshot the blog post and sent it to Kenneth Bryce with a note explaining the context. He responded that it was interesting, but not proof of anything related to my case. Strategic thinking wasn't illegal, and nothing in the post explicitly endorsed false accusations. 3 weeks after my termination, I was at a grocery store when I ran into Alicia Foster from my former department. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, but didn't avoid me completely. We exchanged awkward greetings, and I asked how things were at Meridian. Alicia glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then said quietly, "Thomas Qley got promoted to lead senior analyst. Harold announced it yesterday. He's basically taken over your role in projects." The confirmation of what I'd suspected felt like a punch to the gut. "Did Thomas and Vanessa seem close before she filed her complaint?" I asked. Alicia hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her current employer and whatever relationship we'd had as colleagues. "They had lunch together a lot," she admitted, "and Thomas recommended her for the Carlson project even though she wasn't experienced enough. Some people thought it was weird how much he advocated for her." She paused. "Look, I don't know what really happened with you and Vanessa, but the timing was suspicious. You get fired and suddenly Thomas gets your position. Some of us noticed. I asked Alicia if she'd be willing to provide a statement about Thomas and Vanessa's relationship and the suspicious timing. She immediately backed away, both literally and figuratively. "I can't get involved in this. I need my job. I have student loans and rent. I'm sorry about what happened to you, but I can't risk becoming a target." I understood her fear, but her refusal highlighted the impossible position I was in. Anyone who might have information that could help me was too afraid to speak up, knowing they could be fired or retaliated against. The system protected the company and the accuser while isolating the accused. I thanked Alicia for the information she'd given me and watched her hurry away, clearly relieved to escape the conversation. I stood in the grocery store parking lot surrounded by people, going about their normal lives, and felt completely alone. Everyone who could help me was too afraid or unwilling. The legal system was prohibitively expensive and biased against me. My career was destroyed, and Vanessa Sterling and Thomas Qley were benefiting from the destruction they'd caused. That night, I made a decision. If the legitimate channels of justice were closed to me, I'd find another way. I'd document everything, investigate thoroughly, and build an airtight case proving Vanessa's complaint was false and that she'd filed it to benefit Thomas Qley. Then I'd expose them both in a way that would destroy their careers, just as they'd destroyed mine. It wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. It was about justice and truth, about refusing to accept being victimized by lies and corruption. I started by creating a timeline of everything that had happened, every interaction with Vanessa, every email, every project we'd worked on together. I documented Thomas and Vanessa's interactions that I'd witnessed or heard about. I researched defamation law and wrongful termination cases, looking for precedents that might help. I set up a separate email account and started reaching out to people who'd left Meridian, hoping former employees might be more willing to share information without fear of retaliation. One former employee, a woman named Claire Hobbs, who'd left Meridian 8 months ago, responded to my inquiry. We met at a bar across town, and Claire revealed something explosive. Vanessa Sterling was dating a guy named Justin Morales, who worked in the IT department before I left. They tried to keep it quiet, but people knew. Justin got fired for accessing confidential employee records without authorization. HR said he was looking at salary information and performance reviews for people in other departments. I asked if she knew why Justin would have done that. Claire shrugged. Rumor was he was trying to help Vanessa get ahead, maybe giving her inside information about competitors or upcoming reviews. He never admitted it, but the timing made sense. Vanessa seemed to know things about people that she shouldn't have known. This was important. If Vanessa had a history of using inside information and personal connections to gain unfair advantages, it supported the theory that she'd filed a false complaint for strategic purposes. I asked Claire if she'd be willing to provide a written statement. She agreed, saying she had no loyalty to Meridian after they'd passed her over for promotion 3 times. I hired a private investigator named Raymond Ortiz, who specialized in corporate investigations. His fee was $150 an hour, which I couldn't afford, but Laura agreed we should use our savings if it meant potentially clearing my name and recovering my career. Raymond spent 2 weeks digging into Vanessa's background, Thomas Qley's activities, and the circumstances around my termination. He discovered that Thomas and Vanessa had been seen together outside work on at least 6 occasions in the month before she filed her complaint. They'd been at the same bar, the same restaurant, and had been photographed together at a company happy hour where they'd been unusually close and intimate. Raymond also found Justin Morales, the IT employee who'd been fired for unauthorized access. Justin was bitter about his termination and willing to talk. He admitted he'd been dating Vanessa and had accessed employee records at her request. She wanted to know about performance reviews and who was vulnerable to being cut during budget reductions. She said she needed the information to protect herself and position herself better for advancement. Justin claimed he didn't know she was planning to file a false harassment complaint, but he confirmed that Vanessa was calculating and strategic about her career advancement. Raymond's investigation uncovered something even more damaging. He found evidence that Vanessa had filed a similar sexual harassment complaint at her previous employer, the boutique consulting firm she'd worked at before Meridian. That complaint had resulted in a senior consultant being placed on administrative leave, though the case had apparently been settled quietly, and the consultant had left the company. Raymond obtained a copy of the settlement agreement through a contact at the firm. The consultant, a man named Gregory Russo, had agreed to a $75,000 settlement and non-disparagement agreement in exchange for the firm dropping the investigation and providing a neutral reference. The pattern was clear. Vanessa had used false sexual harassment allegations before to eliminate competition or extract money. This was her strategy, the one she'd obliquely referenced in her blog post about changing the battlefield when you can't win on merit. I contacted Gregory Russo through LinkedIn and explained my situation. He was initially reluctant to talk, bound by his settlement agreement, but when I explained that Vanessa had done the same thing to me, he agreed to meet. Gregory Russo was in his early 40s, now working at a smaller firm after his career had been damaged by Vanessa's accusations. He looked tired and bitter when we met at a coffee shop in his city. She was assigned to a project I was leading, he explained. We worked together for maybe 6 weeks. Everything was professional. I never touched her, never made inappropriate comments. Then she filed a complaint, claiming I'd made advances, touched her shoulder inappropriately during a meeting, and sent suggestive emails. The emails she referenced were completely benign work communications that she completely mischaracterized. But HR didn't care. They pressured me to settle to avoid a lawsuit and bad publicity. I took the settlement because fighting would have cost more than $75,000 in legal fees and destroyed my reputation even more. He paused, his expression hardening. 2 months after I left, the partner who'd been competing with me for a promotion got elevated. Vanessa had been close with that partner, had done work for him that positioned him well. I always wondered if she'd targeted me to help him, but I could never prove it. I asked Gregory if he'd be willing to testify about his experience if I pursued legal action. He said his settlement agreement prohibited him from making disparaging statements about Vanessa or the firm, but he might be able to testify if subpoenaed and required by court order. The information was valuable regardless. A pattern of false accusations was powerful evidence of Vanessa's character and modus operandi. Raymond also discovered that Thomas Kingsley had significant gambling debts. Credit reports and public records showed he owed approximately $45,000 to various creditors and had been sued twice for unpaid debts in the past 3 years. His financial desperation provided a motive for eliminating competition for the senior analyst position, which came with a $20,000 salary increase. If Thomas and Vanessa had conspired together, his financial problems gave him reason to help her scheme. The pieces were coming together. Vanessa had a history of using false accusations to advance her career. Thomas had financial motivation to eliminate me, and they'd been unusually close before she filed her complaint. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but I needed proof of conspiracy. I decided to record a conversation with Vanessa. It was risky and potentially illegal depending on state recording laws, but I researched and confirmed that our state was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations I was part of without the other person's knowledge. I created a plan to approach Vanessa in a public place and try to get her to admit something incriminating while recording on my phone. I waited outside Meridian's office building one evening, watching employees leave for the day. When Vanessa emerged, I approached her before she reached her car. She looked startled to see me, then immediately defensive. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. "There's a restraining order." There was no restraining order, which told me she was either lying reflexively or had been advised to claim one existed. I had my phone in my jacket pocket recording. "I just want to understand why you did this," I said, keeping my voice calm and non-threatening. "I never harassed you. You know I didn't. Why would you file a false complaint?" Vanessa's face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I reported was true. You made me uncomfortable with your comments and behavior. Just because you don't remember it or think it wasn't a big deal doesn't mean it didn't happen." Her response was rehearsed, clearly something she'd been coached to say. I tried a different approach. "Was it Thomas's idea? Did he ask you to file the complaint so I'd be eliminated and he'd get my position?" Vanessa's expression flickered, just for a second, and I saw surprise before she recovered. "That's absurd. Thomas had nothing to do with my complaint. You're paranoid and desperate, which is exactly the behavior that got you fired." She started walking toward her car, and I followed, keeping a respectful distance, but continuing to press. "I know about Gregory Russo. I know you filed a false complaint at your previous firm, and he settled for $75,000. You're running the same scam. I have evidence, and I'm going to expose you." That stopped her. She turned back, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "You don't have anything. Gregory signed an NDA. You're bluffing." The fact that she knew Gregory had signed an NDA suggested she was very aware of what had happened at her previous employer. I kept recording. "Gregory is willing to testify if I sue you for defamation. Claire Hobbs is willing to testify about your relationship with Justin Morales and how he accessed confidential records for you. Raymond Ortiz has documented you and Thomas meeting privately multiple times before you filed your complaint. I have your blog post about changing the battlefield when you can't win on merit. I have evidence of Thomas's gambling debts and his motive to eliminate me. I'm building a case that proves you conspired to file a false complaint." Vanessa stared at me, and I could see her mind working, calculating. "You can't prove any of that. Even if you could, Meridian won't care. HR already made their decision, and no one will hire you after being accused of harassment, so you have no leverage." She was right that I had no leverage with Meridian, but she was wrong about not caring. "I'm not going after Meridian. I'm going after you. Defamation lawsuit naming you personally. You'll spend years in litigation and tens of thousands on lawyers. Every future employer will see that you're being sued for filing false harassment complaints. Your reputation will be destroyed, and you'll lose in court because I have evidence and witnesses. Vanessa's face went pale. You're harassing me right now. I could call the police and have you arrested. I held up my hands. I'm standing in a public parking lot having a conversation. No threats, no physical contact. But you're right that we should involve authorities. I'll be filing police reports for fraud and conspiracy. I'll also be contacting the state bar to file ethics complaints against you if you're licensed, and I'll be sending everything I've found to Meridian's board of directors and their legal department. Vanessa's voice rose. You can't do this. I'll file for a restraining order. I'll tell them you threatened me. The desperation in her voice told me I'd hit a nerve. She was scared because she knew I had enough evidence to cause serious problems for her. File whatever you want, I said. The recording of this conversation shows I haven't threatened you, but you should know that I'm not stopping until everyone knows what you did. I turned and walked away, leaving Vanessa standing beside her car. My phone was still recording in my pocket, and I'd captured her acknowledgement of Gregory Russo, her admission that she knew about his NDA, and her threats to file false police reports and restraining orders. The recording wasn't a confession, but it was evidence of consciousness of guilt. I met with Kenneth Bryce the next day and played him the recording. He listened carefully, making notes, then delivered his assessment. This helps, but it's not enough for criminal charges. Police won't pursue fraud or conspiracy based on what you have. However, it's sufficient evidence to support a defamation lawsuit. Her statement that you made her uncomfortable is provable as false based on your evidence, and her consciousness of guilt plus the pattern of prior false accusations creates a strong case. He paused. The problem is still cost. Filing suit will require a $15,000 retainer, and the case could take 2 to 3 years. Even if you win and get a judgment, actually collecting money from her might be difficult if she doesn't have significant assets. I told him I didn't care about collecting money. I wanted her reputation destroyed and her career ended the way mine had been. Bryce nodded slowly. Then we focus on maximum publicity. File the lawsuit, issue press releases, make sure every employer who searches her name finds the litigation. That's how you inflict the damage you're after. I scraped together the $15,000 retainer using our savings and a loan from Laura's parents. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later in county court. Granger versus Sterling, claiming defamation, intentional interference with employment, and civil conspiracy. The complaint laid out the evidence methodically, the lack of any inappropriate interaction between us, Vanessa's history of filing similar complaints, her relationship with Thomas Kingsley and his benefit from my termination, her statement to me acknowledging prior accusations, and the pattern of behavior suggesting a calculated scheme to advance her career through false accusations. Kenneth Bryce drafted the complaint to be publicly accessible and damaging, knowing that the goal was destroying Vanessa's reputation as much as winning a monetary judgment. We issued a press release to local legal news outlets and business publications, describing the lawsuit and allegations. Several outlets picked up the story, running articles about a former Meridian employee suing a colleague for allegedly filing false sexual harassment complaints. The publicity was immediate and devastating for Vanessa. Her name was now permanently associated with accusations of filing false harassment complaints. Anyone searching her name found articles about the lawsuit. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with connection requests from reporters and angry messages from people who'd read about the case. Thomas Kingsley's name was also mentioned in the articles as allegedly benefiting from the scheme, which damaged his reputation as well. Meridian's corporate communications team issued a statement saying they stood by their original investigation and decision, but the public relations damage was done. The company looked foolish for having fired someone without proper investigation and for apparently being manipulated by an employee with a history of false accusations. Meridian's general counsel contacted Kenneth Bryce within a week of the lawsuit being filed, requesting a meeting to discuss potential settlement. I initially refused, wanting to pursue the case to trial to maximize Vanessa's exposure and punishment, but Bryce convinced me to hear their offer. The meeting took place at Meridian's law firm, a downtown office with conference rooms overlooking the city. Meridian was represented by their general counsel, a woman named Patricia Donovan, and an outside attorney from a major firm. Kenneth Bryce and I sat across from them while Patricia outlined their proposal. Meridian is willing to settle this matter to avoid protracted litigation and negative publicity. We're prepared to offer $250,000 in exchange for dismissal of all claims, a mutual non-disparagement agreement, and confidentiality regarding the settlement terms. It was a substantial offer, more than I'd expected. Kenneth started to respond, but I cut him off. I want more than money. I want my job back, or a position equivalent to what I had. I want my personnel file corrected to remove any reference to sexual harassment. I want a letter from Meridian to potential employers stating I left in good standing. And I want Vanessa Sterling and Thomas Kingsley terminated and their conduct investigated. Patricia's expression hardened. We're not terminating employees based on your demands. That's not negotiable. However, we could consider removing the harassment reference from your file and providing a neutral employment letter. I pushed harder. You were manipulated by an employee with a documented history of filing false complaints. She used your HR policies to eliminate competition and advance someone she was conspiring with. If you don't investigate and address that, You're condoning fraud. And I'll make sure every article about this case mentions that Meridian knew about Vanessa's history, but chose to protect her over the truth. Patricia glanced at her outside counsel, who whispered something to her. She turned back to me. We'll agree to investigate the allegations in your complaint. If our investigation substantiates your claims about Mrs. Sterling's conduct, appropriate action will be taken. We'll also reinstate you with back pay for the period of termination, though in a different department to avoid workplace conflicts. Your personnel file will reflect that the previous termination was made in error and you left in good standing. We'll provide a letter stating you're eligible for rehire and were a valued employee. The settlement amount will be $200,000 instead of $250,000 given these additional terms. Final offer. I looked at Kenneth, who nodded slightly. It was a better outcome than I'd hoped for. I'd get my career back, clear my record, force an investigation that would likely result in Vanessa's termination, and still receive substantial compensation. I accepted the settlement. The agreement was finalized 2 weeks later, and I received the $200,000 payment along with reinstatement paperwork. Meridian's investigation into Vanessa and Thomas began immediately, conducted by an outside firm to ensure credibility. Raymond Ortiz's evidence was provided to the investigators, along with Gregory Russo's testimony via deposition, Claire Hobbs's statement, and the recording of my conversation with Vanessa. The investigation took 6 weeks, and the findings were damning. The investigators concluded that Vanessa Sterling had likely filed a false sexual harassment complaint as part of a conspiracy with Thomas Qley to eliminate me as competition for advancement. They found evidence of their regular private meetings, communications about me that suggested planning, and Vanessa's pattern of similar conduct at her previous employer. Thomas's financial desperation and immediate benefit from my termination supported the conspiracy theory. The report recommended termination of both employees and potential criminal referral for fraud. Vanessa Sterling and Thomas Qley were both fired within days of the investigation report being finalized. Vanessa's termination letter cited filing a false complaint, conspiracy to defraud the company, and conduct unbecoming of an employee. Thomas was terminated for conspiracy, abuse of position, and ethical violations. Both were escorted from the building by security, experiencing the same humiliation I'd endured. But their humiliation was worse, because everyone knew exactly why they were being fired. The company sent an internal memo explaining that an investigation had revealed serious misconduct by both employees, and that Meridian took such violations extremely seriously. The memo didn't mention my name, but everyone understood what had happened. Word spread quickly through the office and the industry. Vanessa and Thomas were unemployable in financial services after being fired for conspiracy and filing false harassment complaints. Their careers were destroyed just as they'd tried to destroy mine. I returned to Meridian in a senior analyst role in the corporate strategy department, which was actually a better position than I'd had before. My new supervisor, a woman named Leslie Yamamoto, had reviewed the investigation report and welcomed me warmly, making clear that she believed I'd been wronged and she respected that I'd fought to clear my name. My colleagues in the new department treated me with respect and sympathy, and several mentioned they'd followed the case and were glad to see justice done. The back pay settlement covered all the wages I'd lost during my termination, plus the $200,000 provided financial security Laura and I hadn't had before. We paid off our student loans and put a down payment on a better house. The defamation lawsuit against Vanessa Sterling personally was still active, though her insurance company had offered to settle for $50,000 to avoid trial. Kenneth Bryce recommended accepting, explaining that actually collecting a judgment would be difficult and time-consuming. I accepted the settlement, bringing my total recovery to $250,000 plus back pay. The aftermath extended beyond just financial restoration. I contacted every employer who'd rejected my applications during my unemployment and sent them copies of Meridian's letter clearing me and confirming I'd left in good standing. I wanted my professional reputation fully restored, not just at Meridian but throughout the industry. Several companies responded with apologies and offers to reconsider my application, though I was happy in my new role at Meridian. Vanessa Sterling's career never recovered. Her termination from Meridian for filing false accusations became public knowledge, and the lawsuit I'd filed ensured her name was permanently associated with fraud and false harassment claims. She couldn't get hired anywhere in finance or business, and last I heard, she'd moved to a different state and changed careers entirely. Thomas Qley declared bankruptcy due to his gambling debts and unpaid legal fees. His career in finance was over, and he ended up working in retail management, a massive fall from his former position. The outcome was exactly what I'd wanted: complete destruction of the people who'd tried to destroy me. Gregory Russo reached out after reading about my case, thanking me for exposing Vanessa and helping prevent her from doing to others what she'd done to us. He'd started a support group for people falsely accused of workplace misconduct, helping them navigate the legal system and emotional trauma. I spoke at one of their meetings, sharing my experience and encouraging others not to give up fighting for truth and justice. The experience changed me. I'd been naive about how easily false accusations could destroy innocent people and how biased systems were toward believing accusers, regardless of evidence. I'd learned that justice sometimes required going outside traditional channels, gathering evidence independently, and fighting harder than seemed reasonable. Most importantly, I'd learned that truth could prevail if you refused to stop fighting for it. 2 years after my termination and reinstatement, I was promoted to Director of Corporate Strategy. Laura and I had our first child, a daughter we named Hope. Life had not only returned to normal, but had improved beyond where it had been before Vanessa's false accusations. The settlement money gave us financial security. My career had advanced further than it might have otherwise, and I had the satisfaction of knowing I'd fought injustice. And won. Vanessa Sterling had tried to destroy me with lies, thinking she could manipulate the system to her advantage while I suffered powerless. Instead, I'd gathered evidence, built an airtight case, forced a settlement and investigation that cleared my name and destroyed both her career and Thomas Kingsley's. Sometimes justice requires patience, strategy, and refusing to accept being a victim. I'd learned that lesson thoroughly, and I'd made sure Vanessa Sterling learned it too. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.